So in early March, right before quarantine, I found myself in an Amtrak station displaying portraits of historical white men in politics. And there in that upstate New York town of Utica, I searched my memory for a train station, airport, or park that displayed women in sculptures or portraits on the walls. In that moment, I was reminded that collective memory engages history without gendering it, forming these built environments that perpetuate old, tired narratives of power dynamics and conceal significant processes and actors. So scholarship within the Academy is now engaging with the obscured co-creators of history across racial, religious, and gender lines, while also opening out onto public conversations about our current built environment. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what just happened on August 26th, a few weeks ago, the first ever statue of real women was erected in Central Park, which is a really big deal because there were already 23 statues and all of them were of men. So, and yet, even in this historical moment, as scholars examine intersectionality and marginalization, many are overlooking the jagged textures of power systems and the uneven forces that imprint them. So I am using archives at the New York Public Library and elsewhere, including the Jewish Theological Seminary, to write a book that examines the interplay of various fields, including American history, Jewish studies, women's studies, and art history. And my book proposes a new framework for mid-century American Jewish women that accounts for concurrent privilege on the one hand and marginalization on the other. And my book argues that American Jewish women played with restrictions of old models of American identity by exercising the unique skills they earned from positions of marginalization. The women that I work on used soft power, the arts, as their vehicle with which to challenge existing power structures. And in particular, they challenged the American triad hegemony of hard power, men, and white Christians. My book, which is going to be called Playing with Power, Jewish Women in American Culture, 1921 to 1968, will show how American Jewish women paved their way into leadership by leveraging their socioeconomic privileges, marital and familial relationships, and learned dexterity between the domestic and public spheres. So, unlike many Jewish men at the time, these women, who were secretaries, rebbitzins, philanthropists, artists, curators, were super well versed in the translation of academic and religious texts that were very jargony for public consumption in spaces like museums. And this is what enabled them to springboard from the soft power arts and culture realm in order to offer new models of feminine leadership. So tracing from women's suffrage through the late 1960s, this book will not only make the invisible labor of these women visible, but also assert that their quiet revolution in objects and words, because they were writers and museum curators and artists, opened the societal aperture to include Jews and women as architects of American life. Now, at this time, from the 20s to the 60s, anti-Jewish bias lived prominently under the American radar, which means that these women were fighting a system that outwardly welcomed Jews as part of a Judeo-Christian tradition, while inwardly perpetuating anti-Semitism. By telling the stories of these women, my book demonstrates how women who were pushed out of traditional spaces of power and influence charted new courses in expression, insisting upon a feminine place in Jewish life as well as a Jewish place in American culture, and altering both irrevocably. Playing with Power is uncovering and recovering, in particular, 4 women who pioneered new forms of Jewish public culture in America. My project traces how these women, from the immigration of unknown public historian Anna Kleban to the death of playwright, museum founder, and Rebbitzin, Minion Rabenowitz, in 1968. So unsurprisingly, the archives that I've been spending time in mirror the gendered power structures of these women's time and of our own time now. It is nearly impossible to find letters, diaries, documents, and even books by these women, and most of them wrote some. And we'll hear more about this from our respondent, Susan. At the Jewish Theological Seminary, in particular, the papers of Frieda Schiff Warburg, donor of the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue, are located only amidst those of her father and husband. So if you can imagine, I was digging through all these boxes of her husband, Felix Warburg, and also her father, Jacob Schiff, who was a very prominent philanthropist and prominent man. Schiff Warburg is currently still remembered as the daughter of the distinguished Jewish philanthropist Jacob Schiff and the wife of a big banker tycoon, Felix Warburg, who was also a philanthropist for Zionism and other causes. But she was also the only female board member of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she served until the end of her life. Besides that, she was actually a key player in American culture as a donor at the Met, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, MoMA, the Harvard Semitics Museum, which then was huge, and many more. In the collection of Boston's Temple Mishkan Tefillah, which is located at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Rebbitzin Minion Rabenowitz, one of the characters of my book, makes up but one of 14 archival boxes, whereas most of her plays, short stories, correspondences, and beautiful scrapbooks that she made are kept under her husband's name or under the temple's name in the finding aids. And for those of you who are researchers, you know that finding aids are incredibly detailed. So this is a big misstep, in my opinion, on the part of archives. Unfortunately, the male creation myth that we're presented with today of American Jewish museums, from scholarship and just from general collective memory, if you go to the Jewish Museum, overlooks these women altogether. For me, this is not super surprising, given the inaccessibility and totally disorganized nature of the archives. Institutions simply don't value these stories, and so they sit gathering dust in literally unorganized file cabinets. In order to find Anna Kleban, one of my characters, I had to actually order her literal file cabinet from an off-site storage facility, which thank God it still exists because it's totally uncatalogued and no one knew it was there, but I met someone who knew about it and had it sent to me. So these are really unorganized archives. Until my book, nobody has considered the creation of spaces for American Jewish artistic expression as a story of feminine power play, which I'm calling it. Codifying this into the canon will not only mend a broken story by filling in the blanks, it will offer actually a more complete narrative arc that can shape how we see societal power dynamics in the present and in the future. Now that we have an overview of my project, I will turn to two of the women who, in my book, who illustrate these dynamics. Cultural philanthropist Frieda Schiff Warburg, firstly, and Rebbitzin Minion Rabenowitz, secondly. So let us begin with the letter that launched the Jewish Museum, still standing today on Fifth Avenue. And perhaps some of you live in uptown New York City, and I imagine a lot of you have probably walked by this structure on 92nd and 5th, the Jewish Museum. It's actually Frieda Schiff Warburg's home, and it was her gift to American Jews at wartime. In January 1944, Frieda Schiff Warburg wrote a letter to the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in which she announced, "I am now ready and glad to offer my former home at 1109 Fifth Avenue to be used as a museum." And I love her words, they're so beautiful. In her words, the gift was, I quote, "My affirmation of my faith in the fundamental principles of our Jewish traditions, which can be helpful and constructive in the problems of our world today." Now remember, she's writing in January 1944, so this is the middle of World War II. Close to the ending World War II. "It gives me great happiness to think that the house, which for so many years harbored our harmonious family life and was always open to community interests, should now continue to live on to further the ideals of our family traditions." So this gift launched one of the most important episodes in American Jewish history, the birth of the flagship cultural institution, the Jewish Museum that we know today. And the Jewish Museum was and is unique because it was the first ever to achieve a totally new and independent address for Jewish public culture. Furthermore, it outlived all the other early efforts at exhibiting Jewish art, including at the Smithsonian and other institutions, synagogues, places like that. The Jewish Museum stands on Fifth Avenue today as a symbol of a woman who accrued cultural capital, not just in spite of her own social and political marginalization, but actually because of it. So barred from the rabbinic study halls, synagogue pulpits, American courtrooms, and investment banks in which Jewish men were architecting the American community, Schiff Warburg remained an outsider to conventional leadership. Yet she creatively harnessed her tremendous wealth, unique social status, and family ties especially, to become a new kind of female philanthropist. Born into a family of bankers and communal leaders, Schiff Warburg re-envisioned her own domestic space as a communal space for Jewish public culture. As she carefully leveraged her own educational and financial capital and personal connections, she was actually expanding beyond the types of leadership and philanthropy models previously existing amongst women of her standing, offering a new kind of feminine power that would transform the landscapes of American and Jewish philanthropy. By giving voice to the storytellers of Jewish identity in her home, Schiff Warburg reclaimed and reshaped her own domestic space, which was really one of vulnerability and child rearing, as well as significant political, religious, and cultural gatherings and conversations over the course of her lifetime. She lies at the heart of the story of the Jewish Museum, and also at the heart of the story of American Jewish history, because she achieved something that was profoundly innovative. And this innovation was that it was a new model that transformed what was the private and exclusive cultural space of the family and elites into something that was offering public inquiry, and that was a public culture endeavor. Okay, so quick flashback to October 1930. We were just talking about 1944 and her donation. Now let's go back to October 1930. Frieda Schiff Warburg is sitting in an audience in a chair, watching her brother Mortimer shake hands with a leader from JTS to finalize the erection of the new Jacob Schiff Memorial Library at the seminary. So the story that no one talks about is that Mortimer and Frieda, brother and sister, had actually decided together to donate this building to the seminary in honor of their father, Jacob Schiff. And they also split the bill. So they both donated this, to put it bluntly. With their donation, JTS leaders established a museum of ceremonial objects within library walls. And they also hired their first full-time scholar curator. So as she sat in the audience, in other words, Frieda Schiff Warburg in 1930 was watching also the birth of a tiny museum within a bigger library that she co-donated, but she wasn't on stage, so nobody knew that. Earlier on, and as she was in the audience, she was watching her invisible philanthropic hand at work in more ways than one, actually. So if we flip back to 1925, Frieda Schiff Warburg and her husband had purchased a big Benguiat collection, a big collection of art, including 62 Judaica items from all over the world. Their purchase really widened the scope and the quantity of JTS's small pre-existing Judaica collection and planted earlier seeds for a more expansive space in which to exhibit Jewish art. Okay, so moving forward through time, in 1938, Schiff Warburg became the first and only, for the course of her lifetime, woman to join the board of directors of the Jewish Theological Seminary. So interestingly, beginning in 1930, she was already hosting these all-male board meetings in her home, in her own domestic space. And it wasn't until 1938 that she sort of shooed her way in, actually the same year as her husband passed away. So her husband was on the board, and this is what made room for her to join. In addition, as I mentioned, her father was extremely involved at the seminary, and so was her brother. So this was how she was leveraging connections in order to really have a voice on the board and be the first and only woman. The story that I love the most about Frieda Schiff Warburg is on May 6, 1947, a couple of years after she gave this donation, there was an evening event held at the museum, just the opening event, and the leaders of JTS, including the chancellor, said, "Oh, Frieda Schiff Warburg, we have your seat. It's going to be X, Y, and Z, place in the audience." And she wrote back and she was like, "No, I'm not sitting in the audience this time. I will be on stage and I will make a speech." She then had the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Louis Finkelstein, who was extremely well regarded and well known at the time across communities. She had him writing back, "I'm sorry that we were confused about your sitting on the platform, and we will make the necessary changes immediately." It was a very quick response time too. So it seemed as though finally Jewish men were acknowledging in the public sphere what they had known in their homes for millennia, which is that the women sometimes take charge. There's a lot more to say about Frieda Schiff Warburg and her extremely fascinating life. And I am writing a book including her, so I could probably talk about her forever, but we only have a short amount of time. So I'm going to shift to another really important and very colorful character who also is the woman on the portrait for this event. Her name is Minion Rabenowitz, and she was a Rebbitzin and lived in Boston. Minnie, as she went by, which actually also I just learned that my great-grandmother went by Minnie as well, founded her own Jewish museum in Boston. Like Schiff Warburg, Minnie had tremendous, tremendous power and privilege as the wife of a rabbi. She was also at one of the wealthiest congregations in the Northeast. It was called Mishkan Tefillah. She was also, like Frieda Schiff Warburg, a pathbreaker in the display of Jewish objects and became an expert community builder and really a visionary for the future of Jewish art and the role that it was going to play in America. That's best exemplified by a 1941 event at the museum. So in 1941, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and Rebbitzin Minion Rabenowitz teamed up on the stage of Mishkan Tefillah in the museum to explain their vision of a future America and to explain really what they felt about what democracy was and meant. Standing in the new Minion Rabenowitz Jewish Museum in Boston, they heralded freedom of religious worship as the core of American democracy. Roosevelt's support of the Jewish Museum of Boston is truly emblematic of the theme of this book: women using culture as a catalyst for re-examining identity politics. So I'm going to repeat that because that bears repeating. Roosevelt's support for the Jewish Museum is emblematic of the book's theme, which is women using culture as a catalyst for re-examining identity politics. Just the way that the movement Monumental Women just erected a statue in Central Park of women. That is a way in which women are using culture still as a catalyst for re-examining identity politics. Eleanor Roosevelt's 1941 visit came on the heels of several crucial turning points in American history, ones that confronted the Roosevelt administration with questions about the strength and substance of American patriotism and the nature of American identity. After hundreds of Jews and non-Jews finished clapping for Roosevelt's speech in 1941, Minion Rabenowitz presented the First Lady with a bouquet of flowers. She thanked her for her words and called her a woman of valor, of great courage. The biblical phrase would have been totally identifiable to Jews as a biblical quotation, but Minnie's translation of great courage would have been much more accessible in meaning to a broader audience. And she was ever the public communicator, packaging ideas for a really varied audience, including the ideas of her husband through her museum. At the end of the event, Rabenowitz gave Eleanor Roosevelt a private tour of her museum, pointing out especially objects with ritual meaning and significance, and really explaining to her what Jewish customs were and meant. Roosevelt's visit would change the museum's public image indelibly. Suddenly, the movement to elevate Jewish objects into the canon of Western culture grew with a sense of total urgency and entered mainstream America during World War II. So where others sought to carve out a Jewish place in politics, the academy, religious life, and other traditional spaces of leadership or hard power, Rabenowitz sought to carve out a Jewish place in the formulation of American character through museums, which was a totally new modality in the broader landscape. The Jewish Museum of Boston inaugurated the birth of Jewish museums during the post-war years, including the Jewish Museum in New York, as well as the Identity Museum movement of the 1960s and 1970s. In other words, museums were not new. There were lots of museums and they were art museums. But what was new was the identity museum concept. So now we have a museum of Native Americans. In DC, we have a museum of African American heritage. We have all kinds of identity museums, which really began with these institutions in the 40s. With the founding of this museum, Minion Rabenowitz displayed Jewish objects as expressions of American values, carving out a place for Jewish heritage in American democracy. In what was a totally new way for her and her community, she was also an extremely public writer. She wrote all the time for the Jewish Advocate, and her articles are freely available on the web thanks to the New York Public Library's resources. Actually, because of COVID, they are now open to anyone with a New York Public Library ID. Minion Rabenowitz wrote articles and plays that challenged the status quo, each in their own ways. So Minnie wrote theater scripts, she wrote books, she wrote short stories, she wrote all kinds of things. And by far, my favorite of hers, many of the things she wrote, by the way, were examining the intersections between gender, power, culture, Jews, American democracy, all kinds of things, but in a cultural way. So not in a political, let me examine what's happening way, really in a way that was, let me tell stories and invite everyone to consider gender and power and Jews. So my favorite play of hers by far is her 1938 Hadassah School for Husbands, which frankly is so funny that I was crying of laughter. And even more than that, it's very interesting because it features men supporting basically men who are housewives in support of their wives' careers, their public-facing Zionist careers. So again, the play was called Hadassah School for Husbands. And in this play, the Zionist women who live in Palestine repeat over and over again about their husbands. They just don't understand what we're doing and why it's so important. They're just at home doing all the silly things. And there are all these great quotes about it. So at the end of the play, the husbands remark in this poem, "An American girl with a permanent curl is a lovely thing to see. But when she's nothing but this, what an empty young miss this lovely young girl can be. When a pleasant young wife gives up most of her life to facials and cleaning and shopping, when she has nothing but these, how hard she's to please, to her excess, there's never a stopping. When your life loves Hadassah, don't ever sass her. It's a lovely thing to see. She bakes and sells tickets, so Zion's babes have no rickets, and a useful Jewess is she." So in this play, the women characters perform Hadassah's Zionism, literally on a stage and in this published book, as proxy for female-powered Jewish nation building. Over the course of her long career, Minnie's subversive content displayed Jewish feminine power overtly. So one more fun addition for those of you who are Jewish history buffs or Jewish music buffs, Leonard Bernstein was actually in this play. The Jewish musician Leonard Bernstein was a member of Temple Mishkan Tefillah, along with a bunch of other famous Jews. It was a really prominent congregation, and his brother is in the play too. So as I mentioned at the start of this talk, zooming back out for a minute, until just a few weeks ago, there were 23 statues in Central Park representing real historical people. Not a single one of them was a woman. Now, thanks to Monumental Women, there is now the movement, Monumental Women, the organization. There's now one beautiful new statue of 3 women that you can find in the heart of Central Park's Literary Walk. So perhaps our message for Minnie and Freda today is there's been tremendous, unthinkable progress since their time. And we have a lot more work to do. So my work with these women has really been a forcing function for me to examine the current state of Jewish philanthropy in America, which is still the country with by far the most Jews. So during World War II, the characters that I work on saw American Jews as the future of the Jewish world, the builders of the worldwide Jewish world. And in terms of philanthropy, as well as financial and human capital, that was true then, and it's still resoundingly true. We have by far the most Jews and by far the most capital than any other country in the world, and we did then too. And yet, despite all of this, I'm noticing that since these women lived, not so much has changed in actuality. Women are still today working on creative ventures that support the American Jewish community, many of them outside the traditional institutions and the deeply ingrained financial systems that support them. Such organizations are supporting the next generation of men and women who really have the potential to breathe life into the future of the American Jewish community. Their equitable, representative leadership, as well as their innovative approaches, provide much needed alternative footholds into Jewish engagement for younger generations. For example, Sarah Waxman's At the Well is reviving ancient Jewish new moon rituals and somatic healing practices, while Amanda Berman's Zioness is marrying liberal feminist activism with Jewish identity and Zionism. Unfortunately, habitual behavior and an inherited philanthropic ethos have created a market inefficiency whereby there is not visibility between financial supply on the one hand and organizational demand on the other hand. Beyond that, there's also a perceived switching cost when donors are presented with new opportunities for diversifying their philanthropic efforts. In truth, there's a really robust ecosystem of creative soft power organizations already in existence to serve Jews in America, as well as ample opportunity to grow new organizations. As such, I am now beginning to consider new frameworks for disrupting traditional models of Jewish American philanthropy to provide more equitable access and opportunities to amplify these important new voices. In addition to now applying for postdoctoral fellowships as I finish up my dissertation, I am now conceiving of how to use my book and what I found in this project as a case study for new frameworks and vehicles in the philanthropy landscape. I'm really excited to connect with anyone who's thinking about the future of American Jewish philanthropy so that we can co-create more sustainable solutions for the future, ones that would make Freda, Minnie, and all of the other women who created the foundation for American Jewish culture really proud. So I want to end by thanking my parents, my mom and dad, and my two amazing brothers, and my beautiful spirited sister, all of whom have watched me move from a dissertation on Zionist culture when I was learning Arabic years ago to one on these women that I never expected to find in the archives. In particular, this project would not have been possible without the unwavering support of my mother, who has nurtured my growth and transformation without judgment since I was born. She is the example of the feminine power that guides my research in ways that she isn't fully aware of yet. And if she's okay with it, she'll probably be the introduction to my second book. Thank you, everyone. I think now we have time for a Q&A and a response.
Thank you, Ariel, for a fascinating talk about the role of women in Jewish institutional and cultural and philanthropic history, and also why this story matters. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's respondent, Dr. Susan Chevlo. And as I do, please remember to send in your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Dr. Susan Chevlo is the director and chief curator of the Dorfner Judaica and Art Collection at the Hebrew Home in Riverdale. She is the former curator at the Jewish Museum in New York and has taught in the program of Jewish art and visual culture at the Jewish Theological Seminary. She is the author of numerous essays and texts on American and Israeli artists, including Leonard Fried, Hannah Iverson, Ben Katcher, and many others. A A few weeks ago, Dr. Chevlo delivered a lecture at Fordham titled "A Lens Onto the Jewish Past: How Do Prints of Eastern European Jewish Life Speak to Us Today?" which is accessible on the Jewish Studies YouTube channel and via our weekly newsletter. So thank you, Susan, for delivering a response to Ariel's talk today.
Okay. Hi. I'm going to share my screen. Do you see me? Uh-oh, here we go. Okay. Okay. You can see and hear me, right? Okay. Let me just get this to full screen. Okay, I was so moved by Ariel's tribute to her mom there. As a Jewish mom, I'm verklempt, Ariel, from that. That was really lovely. So I'm going to begin here in my short response. I'm going to ask Ariel a couple of questions, and then we're going to move on to Q&A from our audience, so you can, as Sarit said, you can type that into the chat. So a couple of weeks ago, Ariel sent me a draft of her paper, the paper that she presented today, and when I was reading it, I came to a sudden stop at the name Louise Darmstadter Kaiser, who Ariel did not talk about today, but is one of the women who is her subject and who she's been researching. So I came to that name and I said, oh, I know that name. I thought I continued reading and I said, oh, Louise Kaiser, of course. Yes, she was the rather obscure artist whose relief sculpture that I can't even find an image of today hung in the outdoor courtyard of the List extension to the Jewish Museum on Fifth Avenue. So you see the building on the right here on the screen, the original Jewish Museum, the Warburg Mansion, and this List extension that was actually taken down when the museum was expanded actually a couple of decades ago. And so there was this relief sculpture by this woman named Louise Kaiser that hung on the right-hand side as you walked up those steps into the courtyard. It hung on the wall. And I had started working at the Jewish Museum in 1989, and at the time, that's where that sculpture was. And so I'm reading the draft of Ariel's paper, and I just go, literally, oh my God, because this woman whose work was obscure then and is essentially unknown today was not only an artist, who, as Ariel tells us through her research, she was an artist, she was a professor of fine arts, and a graduate of the Munich Academy. She was also married to the first curator of the Jewish Museum and an unacknowledged co-curator with him. And on her immigration papers, as I know from Ariel's research, it said basically housewife when she emigrated, and her husband had a profession, Stephen Kaiser. And her brother was also involved in the Jewish Museum. His name was Franz Darmstadter, and I knew him as Frank Darmstadter because his name was stamped on many black and white photographs of works from the Jewish Museum collection because he was a photographer taking their pictures. So having worked at the Jewish Museum a long time ago and for about 15 years, I asked myself, well, what else didn't I know about this history? And why did it matter? I asked myself. And then there's Frieda Schiff Warburg herself here. So working at the Jewish Museum and then teaching about the history of European and American Jewish and Holocaust museums, I was also, I thought, knowledgeable about the histories of these institutions. Of course, Frieda Schiff Warburg had given her house on Fifth Avenue for the Jewish Museum in 1944, and it was dedicated and opened as the museum in 1947. But that she was the first female trustee at the Jewish Theological Seminary and had a role in the acquisitions that would form the core of the museum's holdings many years earlier was something I didn't know as much about. Mostly, I learned about the men who had shaped the collection and contributed to acquisitions. I wondered, what else didn't I know, and why did it matter? In 2017, I attended the Council of American Jewish Museums annual conference held that year in Boston. Among the conference's side trips were a visit to the Vilna Shul and a walking tour of its neighborhood in the center of the city. We also spent the first day of the conference attending a luncheon and conference sessions at Temple Israel, but a museum at Mishkan Tefillah, and the story of the woman who had founded it, Minion Rabenowitz, there was not a word. And so today I wonder, what else didn't I know, and why does it matter? And so to open up the discussion, I want to ask Ariel, you're bringing to light the history of Jewish women's roles in the founding of U.S. Jewish museums. Why does this matter?
Great question. Well, I wonder what it would have been like if you were at the Jewish Museum and you had an example of female leadership, meaning, Susan, when you got a job at the Jewish Museum, I wonder what it would have been like to have known Louise Kaiser as a curator. I wonder what seeds are planted when we know about historical women who have been in positions of power and have done things that we might not know that they have, or that we might not know that we're capable of doing ourselves. I have a friend who works in tech, and she says, startups and tech, and she says, how do you know that you can be a leader if you just don't have examples of yourself as a leader? And women are so underrepresented in so many different ways that I think women in various industries, including tech and others, just kind of don't know what's available or don't know about history. So I think with the knowledge of history, someday if I have a daughter or daughters, I want them to grow up with examples of women in all industries. I want them to grow up with the knowledge that women did things like this in positions of leadership in a lot of industries as co-creators and co-beginners and co-workers with their husbands or brothers or fathers or sons or whoever else they worked with.
Yeah, so what's interesting, let me just respond to your response and then I'll go on to my next question, because I actually came to the Jewish Museum when we had, and as they do now, have an incredible and dynamic leader, and that was Joan Rosenbaum, and she was you know, an incredible example. And so it's even more, you know, it's almost like ironic to me here. A woman had assumed that position of leadership, and there'd actually been another woman director right before her, but this prehistory, you know, it was always like, oh, only the women's movement perhaps in the 60s and the 70s, and you know, that generation had created the change, but actually there were all these pioneer women before, and we didn't know about them. So I think that was, you know, that was incredible, you know. But I will also say that I had an amazing male mentor at the Jewish Museum, so I give him a lot of credit as well, Norman Kleeblatt, who changed my life. But it would have been nice and good to know about that earlier history. And so then I have another question. This is just, you know, irresistible to show this society portrait of a young Frieda, Frieda Schiff, before she was married in 1894, a work in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I just imagine that, you know, every young woman of a certain socioeconomic background was having these gorgeous portraits made. So my next question is, so the other thing that very much interested me in your paper are the class differences, perhaps even the ethnic Jewish differences between your two subjects, and the different ways their marginalization within their Jewish worlds shape their roles. So I think of the middle class and highly educated Rabenowitz, who had no children and was the wife of a rabbi, working among a lot of women in Hadassah and in the synagogue, and how these women might have had power as a group. And then on the other hand, I think of the enormously wealthy but less formally educated Schiff Warburg, first as a mother and wife, and then as a widow, operating among a bunch of men, as you said, as the only woman on the board at JTS, and I wonder how she got things done. So what were the challenges each of these women faced, and how did their socioeconomic status lead to different challenges for each, or similar challenges? How did their class differences and positions within their communities empower them? Can you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. So when you look at someone like Frieda Schiff Warburg, who was leveraging her connections and her father's really hefty involvement in not only JTS, but the museum scene, it seems unique in the landscape of Jewish American women at the time. In other words, Frieda Schiff Warburg is really a standout leader because of her family in large part, and not just because of her family, because, you know, her family, I've never found record of her family encouraging her to join the board of JTS. I've never seen record of her father encouraging her to become a donor, but she grew up with him. So I think that that is unique. And Minion Rabenowitz, on the other hand, was the child of recent immigrants. She was born in the United States, but she was the child of an immigrant family who moved to Charleston and then moved to Baltimore, and they landed in Baltimore, and then she went to Barnard, while Frieda Schiff Warburg surprisingly never actually went to college. So there were these varied privileges and non-privileges, like Frieda Schiff Warburg didn't go to college. She only went to grade school and high school. So they did know of each other. The women I'm writing about, a lot of them knew of each other. I'm writing about 4 women. Louise Kaiser and Anna Kleban are socioeconomically disadvantaged women. So the 2 women I presented today are, you know, Minion Rabenowitz was stable and her husband was a rabbi, but she was not a big cultural philanthropist. So I think they all have different privileges and they're all unique to women, it seems. For Frieda Schiff Warburg, it was her strong family life, and also her son became a longtime board member of MoMA and someone who really breathed life back into the Jewish Museum after she passed away. So for Frieda Schiff Warburg, it was the family structure and the interpersonal relating dynamics that made her strong, basically, or that she capitalized on. And for Minion Rabenowitz, it was more community organizing, I would say, although she would have never used that word, of course. Organizing this synagogue sisterhood and writing to sisterhoods around the country and really organizing people outside of her family because her parents were not privileged. And another woman I work on, her mother was a housekeeper. So, and that was actually what she listed herself as in her naturalization papers, Anna Kleban. She was an immigrant who lived with her uncle, who was a JTS professor. So yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So I had another question, but Sarit, it looks like you have a lot of questions, and if you want to go to the audience, and then if we have time for my last question, otherwise, I think it's time to move on to outside questions.
Yes, that sounds wonderful, and then we'll circle back to you, so you'll be able to ask the last question.
Okay.
I'm going to field the questions that we received, and I'm going to do it sort of in categories. So sticking for a few minutes with the stories and the significance of the women you spoke about, and then sort of expanding out. And there were a few questions about the contributions of the women that you spoke about. One is, do you think that the primary feminist contribution of the women that you profile was the precedent they set in asserting their place in the world of philanthropy, that is, by the power of representation, or was their philanthropic initiatives themselves somehow distinctly feminist in some way? So that's one question.
That's a really good question to whoever asked that. I definitely think it's distinctively both. By setting precedent for representation, they were offering other women the chance to also enter a new field. And furthermore, by exhibiting literally new models of Jewish public culture, they were changing the landscape of American culture. Because if you think about the American culture scene, there are all these museums, the Smithsonian in the late 1800s and early 1900s, for those of you who are Jewish historians or interested in learning more, Cyrus Adler was the Judaica curator at the Smithsonian, but it was a small project relative to these huge Jewish museum projects in which women were really leading. So even Cyrus Adler was doing something that was not an independent project. So they set precedent by representing themselves as women. They also set precedent just for Jews in America in general, and really for Jews around the world too, after the Holocaust especially.
I actually had a question as you were speaking that follows up nicely on this question, which is, I'm curious about the impact that the women had on the museum collections themselves. And so, like, it's striking to me that the house, like that the museum is in a house, and then thinking about the actual collection and the way that it presents Judaism as also a domestic practice, and so on. And so I'm curious about sort of what role did they play in building the collection and shaping it, and in the narrative that the museums ended up telling.
So this is another case of classic, what I would call invisible labor, because these women really built the collections and had huge say in what was and wasn't in the collection. So for Frieda Schiff Warburg, in 1925, I mentioned in my talk, she gave a big collection of 62 Judaica objects to JTS, which then entered the museum. So all of the JTS objects that they had prior to 1944 entered the museum in 1947. They were like moved to the Jewish Museum. So a lot of those were objects that she and her husband had donated, and at her behest, she requested her father donate objects too. So she also leveraged her power in that way, which is also pretty cool. So the start of the museum was super based on her imprint. We were talking about Louise Kaiser. I didn't have time to talk about her in my talk, but Louise Kaiser and Frieda Schiff Warburg had a relationship, and they would mail back and forth about what to exhibit and what not to exhibit. So in the beginning, Frieda Schiff Warburg played a big role. The chapter in my book will talk about how instantly after the museum was founded, Frieda Schiff Warburg was excluded from the inter-museum committee, so she stopped having as much of a say, unfortunately. But her son then stepped in, especially after her death. So for Minion Rabenowitz, she's interesting. I'll just give one short tidbit because I know we don't have that much time. She would write to specific donors with specific requests for specific objects on a pretty regular basis, saying, you know, we need a wine cup. Do you have one? We need this to match this. We need another set of Shabbat candles for our upcoming exhibit. So she actually, in the beginning, especially requested specific things. And she really armed the sisterhood itself, this broader Jewish women collective, with the knowledge of what was needed so that they could write to their friends or call their friends and say, we need this, we need
that. That's fascinating. Another question, and related, I think, is to what extent, if at all, were these women engaging with a developing philosophy of cultural pluralism? Did they understand Jewish contributions to the arts as bolstering or craving a Jewish space in America's diverse cultural landscape?
So maybe some cultural pluralism context would be helpful. We have Horace Callan and Israel Zangwill famously sort of had different models. Israel Zangwill had the melting pot model, which probably all of you have heard of. And then there's this Callan concept of cultural pluralism, which is basically the idea that everyone should be expressive of who they are in this kind of quilt of American democracy, as opposed to a big melting pot where you can't see anything. So definitely these women were so behind cultural pluralism. And in my chapter on Minion Rabenowitz, I talk about Harvard and the Menorah Society, which is a publication, a Jewish publication started at Harvard. There was this kind of Jewish intellectual culture of pluralism, of supporting pluralism and Judaism as part of America in a particularist way in Boston. So Minion Rabenowitz was the inheritor of some of these ideas and also part of this sort of movement. And Frieda Schiff Warburg definitely, you know, in her letter, I hope that this will be expressive of my family's values and helpful in the world today. She's basically saying, I want Jews to be helpful in building the world of today after the war. So let's basically work on that here in this space.
A few people are curious about whether the four women at the heart of your study knew each other. Did they work together? Did they interact? And then also, if there was a fifth or a sixth woman you could add to your study, if time was infinite, who would it be and why?
Oh, wow. Those are two really big. The second question is a really big question because I want to write about all the women I encountered in the archives. So the first question, yes, these women all knew each other. Minion Rabenowitz was sort of in the out. She was more, so Minion Rabenowitz's brother married Bertha Zold, who was Henrietta Zold's sister. So they weren't quite sisters-in-law, Henrietta Zold and Minion Rabenowitz, but they were like, I don't know what the term, I don't know if there is a term for that. Essentially, they were like family. They knew each other very well, saw each other all the time. So Minion Rabenowitz was more in the political scene, and Hadassah, but she still knew the three other women I'm writing about. So the three other women all knew each other. I wasn't expecting them to have relationships with one another, but of course they did, as I did my archival research. And Louise Kaiser was the one person in the Jewish Museum who, well, she and her husband really kept in touch with Frieda Schiff Warburg, and they went to her house her new house sometimes. They obviously, she donated her home, so they went to her new home sometimes to say, this is what's up, what do you want next? They were sort of the relationship, they were the glue. And then Anna Kleban was, this is so interesting, the one who was a secretary whose mother was a housekeeper who was an immigrant and lived with her JTS professor uncle for a while. She was in charge silently of moving all the objects from JTS into the Jewish Museum. So she directly corresponded with the leaders of the Jewish Museum, the curators, etc., and a little bit with Frieda Schiff Warburg, but not as much because she was more corresponding with leadership. So they all worked together in these kind of invisible ways, and we can only write the story around what the archives don't say, which is, you know, maybe Anna Kleban had Frieda Schiff Warburg over for Shabbat dinner, but we will never know.
This is great. And one sort of question, continuing with this theme of the women themselves before sort of broadening out, is a question about whether Frieda Schiff Warburg was connected or had relationships with the women who founded MoMA, such as Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Lillian Bliss and Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney at the Whitney. So sort of thinking about these women in a broader network of philanthropic women associated with museums.
Mm-hmm. So again, because the archives don't value these stories, nobody has kept the letters that might have been written between those women. However, I do have record that Frieda Schiff Warburg was, for example, the most prominent donor at the MFA and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in X, Y, and Z years, and that she served on boards. And then you can look at the names of the other people on the boards to see who she served with. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I would imagine that those figures are co-listed in various places, although their actual letters are not, to my knowledge, anywhere that I can find, because again, archivists and these institutions don't know about these stories, don't value these stories. They are really hard to find.
That actually sort of corresponds really well with a question that just came in about the role of archivists in the stories that you're telling, the people who collected and organized the papers of these women, and what is the story of the invisible labor, the gendered invisible labor maybe that goes on in the archives, and that how that impacts the stories that you're able to tell?
Excellent, excellent question. So a lot of the archivists I worked with at JTS are actually pretty gender equitable. So well, there are so few, so it's hard to, you know, make a statistical comment, but let's say there are 5 and 3 or 4 of them are women. 4 of them are women. So that's, you know, the women are the archivists. But if you look at where the funding is coming from, it's actually a funding issue. So you have Jewish donors coming in and saying, I want to fund the organization of Mishkan Tefillah because my mother's mother's mother, father's father's father would want it categorized. So then they fund this, and the archivists get funding from them. So it's a higher structure than just the archivist making choices about what to include and exclude from the narrative. And certainly a lot of invisible labor goes into organizing archives themselves because people are writing finding aids, and we don't always know who those people are. So that is one invisible labor aspect of the creation of these archives. And again, to my point at the end of my talk about Jewish philanthropy, I think that because the tradition of Jewish philanthropy is through, it's just sort of traditional and catching up. I think that when traditional avenues of funding come in, they usually want to fund the history of federation or the history of something like that. And Beth Wenger at Penn, a history professor at Penn, wrote a wonderful article called Federation Men about gender and how federation was or wasn't, well, it was male dominated and had a certain kind of masculinity exhibited in that space.
Thank you. We have a Jewish museum professional who is curious about how you imagine the future of Jewish museums.
Good question. It's COVID. So it's COVID. And, you know, I think that just like I said, people like Sarah Waxman and Amanda Berman are breathing life into the older kind of models of Jewish leadership. I think similarly, there will need to be a reevaluation and a sort of breathing life into these institutions like the Jewish Museum. And what that is, I think, remains to be seen because the broader landscape of museums is so uncertain right now with the current epidemic. So I'd like to see where it goes. And I'm hesitant to add anything remote because that would make me sad, meaning sometimes there are iPads in museums and things like that. And with COVID, there's a lot of virtual exhibits. So my sense is that that's not the future of American Jewish museums, that's not the future of museums in general. It's just the current reality. So yeah.
I have two questions that are related. One is about the role of academic activists, however you want to think about that that concept, as serving as knowledge and research nodes for creating more equitable landscapes in cultural leadership. So sort of I guess the bridge between the academy and the cultural world that you're describing, like what role do you see as playing in your own work in telling these stories, not only in an academic context, but in a broader context? And relatedly, to ask you to reflect on how does one go about building equity and awareness of power dynamics, particularly in institutions that honor long traditions and values and history, sort of how to balance those two.
Mm-hmm. So those are two separate and very interesting questions. I think firstly, what I see as someone who is uniquely positioned in academia and someone who wants to have a more public voice is that there's there is a lack of idea flow. There's, let's say, a lack of capital flow between the academy and ideas and all the ideas that are being generated and basically the world. So I would want to see academics, I think that a lot of academics, probably all of us, probably a lot of us consider ourselves scholar activists in some way. And some of us are more public than others. Some of us are on the news, most of us are not. Some of us are building monuments, most of us are not. So I think that there's, while we all consider ourselves scholar activists, it's hard to really encourage that idea flow. So what I see for my personal future is me serving as a bridge of some sorts between academic ideas and the ideas that are being generated, such as that in my book, and what occurs in the world. So for example, Monumental Women, as far as I know, I'm not sure who's supporting them. I know that they do work with historians, so that's great, and that's an example of scholar activism. And yeah, I don't remember what your second question was now. What was the second question?
The second question was about the balance of, or not the balance, the challenge, let's say, of promoting equity and awareness of power dynamics in institutions that honor long traditions.
So I mentioned a high perceived switching cost, and I do think that that feels true and resonates. I think that many Jewish philanthropists and many, frankly, people in the world who are philanthropists perceive a very high switching cost from donating to a federation or an APAC to switching to an At the Well or a Zioness, because it's unknown, because the future of these smaller institutions are unknown and more creative and seemingly more risky. But what I see is, because of the increasing demand and increasing demand for these new organizations and a weaning kind of populace or community in older institutions, like for example, if I were to ask my friends, I think most of them do not feel represented by Federation. Just my friends who are my age. So they feel more represented by organizations that are newer and creative, and by people who are just a few years older than me, maybe in their 30s, or late 30s. So I think the challenge is, how do we promote equity and honor the history of these really important organizations? For example, Federation has a Lions of Judah program, which in the 60s was tremendously like revolutionary. Suddenly women had a say and women had a voice and women had a position in Federation, and it's still an amazing thing. It's still an amazing program. I wonder what it would look like to increase awareness of where our dollars are going, such that we all have a knowledge that we can ourselves promote equity, both in a federation and also for a new organization. So maybe switching cost is not quite the word. Maybe like people perceive a high risk with putting some of their dollars into new ventures, and some of them into old ones. So that would be how I feel we can promote equity and still honor old institutions, by supporting both and all.
Thank you. I have two questions, or one question from two sources, which is, how can those who are interested, whether because they're young Jews or because they're docents at New York museums, learn about the history that you're telling until your book is published? Are there resources that people who are interested in can find? And if so, what are they? And I guess if not, that's really telling, and we'll just have to eagerly await your book to be able to read more about it.
I love the question. So when I was at the Jewish Theological Seminary literally hunting, crawling through countless papers and archives to look for Frieda Schiff Warburg, and finally finding her, the Jewish Theological Seminary also categorized the Minion Rabenowitz papers. In other words, nothing has ever been written about her except for Shuli Rubin-Schwartz, who is very excitingly, actually, I should say, the new chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. The first female chancellor ever is right now, and it was announced just, I think, a month ago or a few months ago. So her book mentions Minion Rabenowitz in passing. It's called The Rabbi's Husband, or something of that nature, Shuli Rubin-Schwartz. Otherwise, nothing has really been written on these women. You can Google Frieda Schiff Warburg, but there's no book on her. I will say, they, like I said at the start of my talk, they published books themselves. So Reminiscences of a Long Life is a book that Frieda Schiff Warburg published, which of course is no longer in print. So I accessed it in an archive in Cincinnati, the American Jewish Archives. And Minion Rabenowitz wrote her 1938 book of plays that you could probably find online as well. Other than the direct writings of these women, which are hard to find, there's nothing really written about them until me. So you have me and you can email me.
That sounds great. So Susan, I want to give you the opportunity to ask the last question.
Well, we've branched out so far, so this would be coming back in very close to the talk itself. So if we have a few minutes for that last question. So, and it relates also, I think, to the cultural pluralism question. So my last question is regarding, Ariel, what you characterize as the influence of both of these women in creating a Jewish place in American culture. So I think it's notable that you emphasize Rabenowitz's meeting with Eleanor Roosevelt and the way in which the Jewish Museum in Boston could be inserted into the American narrative of freedom of religion. I think this also plays well in Boston, a city associated with the American Revolution. in New York with the Jewish Museum, maybe it's not the same narrative in terms of Warburg. And your talk emphasized the way in which Warburg literally opened her home to the public and how that blurred the spaces between what are understood as traditionally public male and private female spheres. And the quote that you like, and I like very much too, from Schiff Warburg, suggesting that Jewish values can be helpful in addressing world problems, and what the museum project would also be furthering, that the museum project, Warburg said, would be furthering the ideals of family traditions. It was very closely held. So how are these two distinctly different ways that Jewish women were, as you say, insisting upon a feminine place in Jewish life, as well as a Jewish place in American culture? So can you just expand on that a little? Or
will you repeat that last sentence again?
So you talk about how they were insisting upon a feminine place in Jewish life, as well as a Jewish place in American culture, but they weren't doing it exactly in the same way. So what do you see is the differences between that fitting in?
So I think they each had various involvements in politics, and Frieda Schiff Warburg was much less she was involved in Hadassah, but much less than Minion Rabenowitz. In other words, Minion Rabenowitz was a bit more involved in Zionist politics and Jewish national culture in Palestine, and Frieda Schiff Warburg was more concerned with anti-Semitism, actually, and with helping a wide audience to understand Jews and Jewish ritual. So I guess both were concerned with that in their museum. Both were showcasing primarily Judaica and Jewish objects as a way to say, here's a Jewish ritual, here's how it worked, and let us kind of show you that. And they had various political involvements in various different things, but that was their probably commonality, one of their commonalities.
And you said that the papers, the Rabenowitz papers are in JTS. What happened to the museum objects? Do you know?
It's a longer story, and the short answer is, I'm trying to think of how to give a short answer. Basically, the museum is defunct, and most of it was now, some of it is still on display at the Mishkan Tefillah, but really her legacy is the creation of this museum in this moment in particular, because then the synagogue migrated to a different location, and actually the United Jewish Philanthropies donated the space to Alma Lewis, who's a really famous Black culture advocate, and she started a Black culture museum basically at the time, which is a whole nother story, and it's a big can of worms, and there's a lot written about that transfer.
Thank you to both of you and to everybody for joining us for a really fascinating, wonderful conversation and lecture. For those of you who would like to read more about Ariel and her research and a lot more, I just chatted out a link to a research spotlight that the New York Public Library published in advance of this talk. Please join us for our upcoming events, the next of which is on October 14th with Professor Moshe Rossman, and be in touch. And thank you for being a part of this community. And Ariel, we wish you much luck with your research in the library, in the archives. And as I said, we're anticipating your book, which will inform both the Academy, but also people who work at museums and visit museums, and who think about American life and diversity, and what it means to be Jewish in America. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.